Welcome to this presentation of Santa Barbara banks and their Trailblazers through vintage postcards and photographs. My name is George Sampanis, and I will be your host as we open a window into Santa Barbara's past. We will be taking a look at Santa Barbara's early banks starting in the 1870s through the 1930s, and will conclude with the story of one current local bank. This was not my original intent, but tracking and tracing the original banks through the years became quite unwieldy and would become boring for the listener given the continuous name changes, acquisitions, and mergers. Our story opens at the Guerra adobe sometime during the 1830s. Most of us recognize Jose de la Guerra as one of the wealthiest and most influential Santa Barbarinos of the era. There were no banks at the time, so where did the Don Jose keep his coin? Legend has the Don storing his money in a locked room in open chests on the second floor of the wood structure shown here. Quoting from the History of Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, and Ventura Counties, Volume 1, some of his sons, who were not allowed all the pocket money they could conveniently spend, replenished their empty purses from their father's hoard by entering the second story of his stronghouse, boring a hole through the ceiling, and, with a long stick tarred with asphaltum, dexterously extracting the coins from the open boxes below. Well, you see, there were no banks until some 40 years later, when in 1871, Mortimer Cook arrived in our city. Mortimer was born in Mansfield, Ohio in 1826 and died in the Philippines in 1899. In between those 73 years, he lived an interesting, diverse, and adventurous life. When he was 19, he joined the military to fight in the Mexican War. After 5 years' service, he stopped in Santa Barbara on his way to the gold rush, where he struck it rich. He went back to Ohio, married his childhood sweetheart, and honeymooned in New York City. Together, they boarded a ship, joining the rush for gold in British Columbia. There, he operated a ferry and a toll bridge over the Thompson River, the location being known as Cook's Ferry. They returned to Ohio, where Mortimer tried his hand at sheep raising. A severe drought cost him dearly. Then, he was off to Kansas, near Topeka, where he made a fortune in wheat and built another toll bridge, the area's first iron bridge. After a tragic incident, his home caught fire. Cook rescued 2 of his daughters and then collapsed from smoke inhalation. His third daughter died in the blaze. He sold his bridge for $100,000 and headed west to Santa Barbara, the small town he had visited in 1849 on his way to the gold fields. He arrived here on the steamship Orizaba with a second-hand safe he had bought in San Francisco. The transfer from the steamer to the Chapala Street wharf in a small boat was risky for passengers, but to add the burden of a heavy safe in rough seas made it all the more dangerous. Having successfully made it to the wharf with the safe and $40,000 in gold intact, he headed for State Street, where he rented an adobe near the intersection of State and De La Guerra Streets. He placed an advertisement in the Morning Press issue of October 6, 1871, which I paraphrase. Mortimer Cook's private bank, capitalized at $40,000, is now open for business. Hours 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. With that, the Santa Barbara County's first bank was open for business. The hard-working, well-liked, trusted Mortimer Cook won favor with the locals, and 1 year later, he hired Amasa Lincoln, an experienced cashier, to operate the bank. In the 1870s, Santa Barbara business was good, and Mortimer Cook prospered. The next year, the Cooks built and moved into this Peter Barber design mansion. The Victorian house at 1407 Chapala Street is still standing and is currently owned by the Institute of World Culture. Amasa Lincoln, a distant cousin of Abraham Lincoln, came to Santa Barbara in 1869 from Boston. He left a prestigious position as teller in the Massachusetts Bank of Boston to come west and to venture into ranching. He purchased the Tahigas Ranch, formerly the Ortega family grant, some 30 miles west of the city. The family soon tired of the rustic life and commissioned Peter Barber, Cook's architect, to design the Lincoln House, a private home and boarding house on a lot at the corner of Delavina and Sola. One of the guests was Charles Nordhoff, author and writer for Harper's Weekly magazine, and largely responsible for promoting Santa Barbara as a health resort destination. Later, it would become the Upham Hotel, which is still in business today. Amasa and his wife Abby are pictured on the left, and the Lincoln House/Upham Hotel are in the top and bottom right. In August of 1872, Mortimer Cook was involved in a carriage accident in which he sustained a serious leg injury. While recuperating at the Lincoln House, Cook learned that Lincoln had been in the banking business and offered him a job as cashier, thereby combining Cook's capital with Amasa's experience. In this 1873 drawing of our city, in its most prominent structures, we see Mortimer Cook's private bank circled in the top left corner. In March of 1873, as a successor to Cook's private bank, articles of incorporation were signed 2 months later. In May, a charter was granted as the First National Gold Bank of Santa Barbara. It was the first national bank in Southern California, south of San Francisco. The bank's directors were Mortimer Cook, John Edwards, Dr. J.B. Brinkerhoff, Eugene Fawcett, G.W. Williams, and Amasa Lincoln. Cook was appointed president at a salary of $1,200 per year, and Amasa Lincoln cashier at $1,800 per year. Pictured here on top is the original certificate of stock, 10 shares, issued to John Edwards, dated 1873, and at the bottom, 5 shares issued to Joseph and Elizabeth Howard 1 month later. In 1874, Cook purchased the southwest corner of State and Carrillo Streets and built the Cook Building, which became commonly known as the Upper Clock Building. A lower clock building came later at State and East Ortega. Referring to the Cook Building, Walker A. Tompkins in Santa Barbara History Makers said, and I quote, "It also featured ornate iron decorative trim, which unfortunately led to Cook's bankruptcy. The first shipment of ironwork interfered with the cargo ship's compass, causing the ship to lose its way in the dense fog and to run aground on the rocks at Point Arguello. Insurance did not cover the full loss, and Cook was bankrupted by the cost of replacing the iron castings. He sold his bank and his Victorian mansion on Chapala Street, ending the Santa Barbara chapter of Mortimer Cook's life," end quote. Another version of his bankruptcy was the drought of 1877, which caused financial hardship to many Santa Barbarans who had heavily invested in livestock. Adding to his woes were vacancies in the building, creating an adverse cash flow. Whatever the cause, he was forced to sell his house at a huge loss and left town for other opportunities. Leaving Santa Barbara, Cook moved to the Washington Territory. There, with Indian guides, he explored a site on the Skagit River to establish a new town. He named the new town Bug. It was aptly named for the mosquitoes infesting the site. Loggers swore they were the size of bats. The name had a sting to it, no pun intended, and was changed to Cedro, the Spanish word for cedar. Cedro, but with an S instead of a C. This was not the first town he founded. The first was years earlier in British Columbia. At Cedro, he opened a general store and built a wharf on the river. The town grew rapidly. Then he opened a sawmill manufacturing cedar shingles, making yet another fortune. Once again, he lost it all with bad investments in farmland and in hogs elsewhere on the Olympic Peninsula. Mortimer's entrepreneurial spirit could not be quenched. Undaunted, he moved his family to the Philippines, harvesting mahogany, where he made his last fortune, passing away there in 1899 at age 72. Let us now return to the First National Bank. In 1877, after a San Francisco bank failed, a run on the bank here was diverted when W. Hollister, then a bank officer, stood by the bank entrance, guaranteeing each depositor with his own personal funds. The stock certificate for 5 shares to O.D. Metcalf is dated 1881. Notice it is signed by Amasa Lincoln on the bottom left and by W. Hollister, bottom right. The image top left is a $10 currency note issued by the originally chartered First National Gold Bank of Santa Barbara. It was redeemable in gold coin and is dated 15 May 1873, the year it was first chartered. In 1881, the name was changed to First National Bank of Santa Barbara, as you can see on the $5 currency note shown below. Also note, 2104 is the designated charter number for the bank. The name was changed again to First National Trust and Savings Bank of Santa Barbara, as shown on the money bag top right and on the $5 bill. At bottom right is a more familiar $5 bill issued under that name and dated 1929. In this 1906 advertisement, the bank assets have grown to $900,000. R.B. Canfield, judge, prominent lawyer, and Santa Barbara Water Company president, is listed as the bank president, and Elwood Cooper, rancher, Olive King, and heralded as the man who brought the eucalyptus tree to the Americas, is listed as bank vice president. Amasa Lincoln's son Henry is the cashier. Business was good, so the old building was torn down and replaced by this building in 1913. Having moved again, the First National Bank building is on the right with the Grecian column front. The 1925 earthquake did major damage to the bank, as can be seen in these 2 postcard views. An armed United States sailor on the left and an armed United States Marine on the right are guarding the heavily damaged bank. Cooks upper clock tower is clearly seen on the left card. It had to be torn down because of damage sustained from the quake. Further up State Street, on the same card, you can see the Granada building, which escaped with minor damage. Displayed here are two more views showing the earthquake damage to the bank. The building was repaired, and the bank continued in business before changing hands several times. It was acquired by Bank of America in 1944, and 10 years later it became part of the First Western Bank and Trust. And in 1961, it became the Santa Barbara branch of the United California Bank. Now let's move on to Santa Barbara's second bank. Another interesting trailblazer arrived in Santa Barbara from the silver mining camps of Nevada. William M. Eddy was born in Marion, New York in 1827. When he was 22, he rounded Cape Horn on his way to San Francisco on the ship Belvedere, arriving in June 1849. 10 years later in 1859, he and several fellow miners made a ditch gold strike in French Corral, Nevada County, California. There, he made a fortune developing a sluice mining system for extracting gold. He also served as postmaster and as superintendent of the Nevada Water Company. Pictured on this slide are images from French Corral, which, at its height, had several thousand residents. Today, 200 people call it home. At the top, from left to right, a typical mining ditch. To the right, the Wells Fargo brick building with its heavy iron hinged doors, which once held millions in gold. On the bottom, a close-up of the bank and its massive doors. In 1871, Eddy sold his holdings in Nevada and came to Santa Barbara, the same year that Cook stepped onto the beach with his safe. Now, from Mortimer Cook's bank, pictured on the top left corner, we transition to the top right corner, where, circled, you'll find William Eddy's County National Bank. Was the town big enough for two banks? Most thought not. Eddy was sure it could. So sure, he opened the bank with $100,000 capitalization on November 1st, 1875, as Santa Barbara County Bank. Eddy was president, S.R. Weldon vice president, Eugene Sheffield cashier. On the board were Eugene Fawcett, legal advisor, and John Edwards. Interestingly, both Fawcett and Edwards were former directors of Mortimer Cook's First National Bank. In 1880, Eddy received a charter, renamed the bank Santa Barbara County National Bank, and 1 year later moved into this impressive building at the corner of State Street and De La Guerra. This $100 bill, dated 1890, was issued by Eddy's Santa Barbara County National Bank, charter number 2456. 16 years after the run of 1877, when W. Hollister stood by the bank entrance guaranteeing each depositor with his own personal funds, Eddy's reaction to the Panic of 1893 was as bold. As a display of confidence and financial strength, he placed trays of stacked gold coins in the bank windows, averting a run on the bank. Pictured here is a 1920 $100 note with yet another name change to County National Bank and Trust Company of Santa Barbara. As an interesting side note, as I was researching this project, I came across this article from the Los Angeles Herald dated 16 February 1898 and dateline Santa Barbara. Let me read it. Two young bankers, with the backing of a sufficient amount of Santa Barbara's hardest cash, leave here this evening for Juneau, Alaska, where they will open the first national bank ever established on Alaskan soil. The president of the First National Bank of Juneau will be W. Summers and the cashier Herman H. Eddy. Both have established reputations in business circles here, and they have behind them the Santa Barbara County National Bank, of which Mr. Summers has been for several years assistant cashier and Mr. Eddy bookkeeper. Mr. Eddy's father is W. M. Eddy, president of the Santa Barbara Bank mentioned, and E. S. Sheffield, cashier of the institution, is an uncle of Mr. Summers. The Juneau Bank will begin existence with a capital of $550,000, a large share of which is subscribed in this city. Mr. Summers visited Juneau last fall and then decided to found the bank, which will soon be in operation. In 1880, Santa Barbara County Bank became Santa Barbara County National Bank. In 1920, it merged with Santa Barbara Trust Company, which was founded in 1915, and became County National Bank and Trust. In 1959, it merged with Crocker Anglo National Bank. In 1963, it merged again to become Crocker Citizens National Bank, and on and on. I won't subject you to any more of that. This postcard and the two that follow show damage sustained from the 1925 earthquake. Cracks to the front of the building and to the left of the telephone pole are visible. A second view of the damaged bank building. And a third. Here are two postcard views from the 1930s, a few years after the earthquake. In the first, at left center and hanging above the balcony and below the medallion window, is a partial view of a huge painting. The bank had commissioned Dan Sayre Grossbeck to paint the oil titled The Landing of Cabrillo for that specific spot. The interior arches seen in both cards were later removed to install lighting and air conditioning. The postcard on the right displays the interior as it faces State Street. Here is a broader view of the interior and a full view of Grossbeck's painting directly under the medallion window. It was this painting that inspired me to do this presentation on Santa Barbara banks. We'll talk a little bit more of this a little later. Our third early Santa Barbara bank was Santa Barbara Savings Bank, opened in 1886 in small quarters in a building on the corner of State and Victoria. 2 years later, in 1888, it was reorganized and named the Commercial Bank. Shortly thereafter, George S. Edwards was named president and remained in that capacity for the next 40 years. The Edwards family has played a significant role in the Santa Barbara banking industry. John Edwards was one of the original directors in both Mortimer Cook's Bank and in William Eddy's County Bank. He came to California during the gold rush in 1849 and moved to Santa Barbara some 20 years later, where he opened a hardware store. He married Elizabeth Sexton, sister of Joseph Sexton, patriarch of the Goleta Sextons, of whom the book 14 at the Table was written. That Joseph Sexton was vice president. John and Elizabeth Edwards had 3 sons and a daughter, Anna. The boys, George, Charles, and Alfred, were all to become presidents of Santa Barbara banks. The banking blood continued to run through their children and their grandchildren. In 1903, at the corner of State and Canon Perdido, they erected this Greek Revival building. The 14-foot columns pictured here were supported by two 3-ton cornerstones which were unearthed in 1991 during an excavation of the site. Here's a nice view of the bank's interior. In 1922, the commercial bank merged with Security First National Bank of Los Angeles, and it became the Santa Barbara branch of Security First National Bank. Immediately after the June 29, 1926 earthquake struck, Edwards took the lead, insisting that all of Santa Barbara banks reopen as a sign of strength in a time of crisis. All the banks opened the next day in temporary quarters like this. Edwards was succeeded as president by Dwight Murphy, one of Santa Barbara's greatest benefactors and a driving force in shaping our city. Dwight Murphy's father, Peter H. Murphy, commissioned architect Francis W. Wilson to design Greystone Terrace, which was built in 1907, and renamed it El Tejado shortly thereafter. Peter had made his fortune in inventing and supplying railroad equipment. In 1884, Dwight was the 6th of 7 children born to Peter and Jenny. While the house was under construction, Dwight came out to have a look. Just a young man, he had health issues and thought the climate would improve his condition. He took a job as a forest ranger and spent considerable time exploring the Santa Barbara backcountry. Having regained his health, he married Grace Price, daughter of Judge Samuel Price and sister of Francis Price, a prominent attorney, and he went back to Pittsburgh, where he became treasurer and then president of an affiliate company. In 1925, Dwight, Grace, and daughter Marjorie moved back to Santa Barbara. The pictures, top left is El Tejado, top right an aerial view of the mansion, bottom left Dwight Murphy at age 40, bottom right the El Tejado, current home of Westmont College's Kerwood Hall. From his boyhood days and his time as a park ranger, Dwight developed a profound love for horses. Murphy leased the Los Prietos Ranch and later purchased part of the San Marcos Ranch in the San Ynez Valley. There he perfected breeding the Golden Palomino horse. He was nicknamed Father of the Palomino and is credited with saving the breed, which had been heading into extinction. In this photograph, he is mounted on the most famous Palomino in the world, his Rey de los Reyes, the King of Kings, which is number 1 in the Palomino registry. Murphy made the time to immerse himself in civic affairs. He was the first presidente of Old Spanish days, having chaired a founding committee the year before. The parade's equestrian flavor to this day is a result of his influence. He was the driving force in the first planning commission formed after the 1925 earthquake. He served on the board of Cottage Hospital, the Community Chest, now United Way. He was president of both Chamber of Commerce and the Park and Recreation Department. He was on the County Forestry Board, on the Committee for Developing the Santa Barbara Airport, along with Earl Ovington and U.S. Senator McAdoo, and was one of the original contributors and founders of the Santa Barbara Foundation. Quoting Edward A. Hartfeld in his book, California's Night on a Golden Horse, Murphy was the silent, behind-the-scenes, often high-dollar influence that made possible a myriad of still existing Santa Barbara landmarks. They include Earl Warren Showgrounds, East Beach, Stearns Wharf, the Fiesta Equestrian Parade, Lake Cachuma, and the nearby Bradbury Dam, and a bevy of public parks, including the Bird Refuge, Cabrillo Ballpark, Mission Park, Franceschi Park, Pershing Park, and ironically enough, Chase Palm Park along the oceanfront. What's more, during the Great Depression, Murphy created a model of providing jobs to unemployed workers that was emulated by President Herbert Hoover. End quote. He further describes Murphy as taking pains to ensure that most of his accomplishments occurred in anonymity. Santa Barbara owes so much to him for his efforts and generous financial contributions to our community. Noting his powerful managerial skills, his foresight, generosity, and modesty in performing humanitarian efforts and deeds, he was recognized as Man of the Year in 1953, to which the Santa Barbara News Press added, he should have been named Man of the Century. Much is owed to Dwight Murphy, Santa Barbara's Renaissance man, and Knight on a Golden Horse, as aptly characterized by author Edward Hartfeld. As we leave Santa Barbara's Renaissance man, we conclude Part 1. In Part 2 of Santa Barbara Banks, we will cover the Central Bank, the Hollister and Dibley Partnership, problems at Glen Annie, the Fugazi Bank and the Giordano Connection, and conclude with one of Santa Barbara's current banks.